He stood in front of the mirror forcing a smile that didn't feel real, his hands trembling as he whispered, "What if I don't know what to do?" And in that moment the truth he had avoided for decades quietly surfaced, because most people have their first kiss at 15 or 18, but Daniel Carter reached 40 without ever experiencing it, building a life that looked complete while hiding an absence no one noticed. And as time passed that silence grew heavier, turning missed moments into a pattern he could no longer ignore, because this isn't just a story about a kiss, it's about fear, time, and a secret he carried for years. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Daniel Carter was the kind of man most people would describe as dependable, the kind you could trust with responsibility, the kind who showed up early, stayed late, and never gave anyone a reason to question his place in the world. And at 40 years old, he had built a life that, on paper, looked complete: a stable career, a respected position in a corporate environment, a routine that ran with quiet precision. And yet there was one detail, one absence so unusual that it had never quite found its way into conversation, not with colleagues, not with friends, and certainly not with the few people who had ever tried to get close to him, because Daniel Carter, despite everything he had achieved, despite every year that had passed, had never kissed anyone, not once, not in high school hallways filled with nervous laughter, not in college where moments like that seemed to happen without warning, and not even in adulthood where relationships were supposed to come with a certain level of understanding. And if you had met him, you wouldn't have guessed it. There were no obvious signs, no dramatic clues, just a quiet normalcy that masked something far more difficult to explain, because the question was never just what had happened, it was why. Why had he never crossed that simple, almost universal milestone? Was it a decision he made somewhere along the way, a line he chose not to cross, or was it something deeper, something that had taken shape long before he even realized it? Was there, and more importantly, what changed after all those years? What happened on that one night that forced him to confront everything he had managed to avoid, because somewhere between the routines, the quiet evenings, and the carefully maintained distance from anything that felt uncertain, something shifted, something that would bring him face to face with a reality he had spent decades keeping just out of reach. And as pieces of his life begin to come into focus, from blurred memories of a childhood that offered few answers, to an adulthood that appeared steady on the surface but carried subtle signs of isolation beneath it, the story starts to reveal itself in fragments, small moments that seemed insignificant at the time but would later form a pattern too clear to ignore. And the more you look at it, the more you begin to realize that this was never just about a single moment he missed. It was about everything that led up to it, every hesitation, every silence, every choice that slowly built a life defined not by what happened, but by what didn't. And as we begin to uncover those moments, one question remains at the center of it all, because the truth behind Daniel Carter's story is far more complicated than anyone expected. Long before Daniel Carter became the man people admired for his discipline and quiet reliability, he was a child who learned very early how to stay unnoticed, the kind of boy teachers rarely worried about because he never caused trouble, never raised his voice, and never demanded attention. But being invisible came at a cost, one that revealed itself in small moments, like standing alone during recess while others formed groups without thinking, or sitting at the edge of conversations he didn't quite know how to enter. And while no single event defined his childhood, there was a steady pattern of being overlooked, of being present but not fully included. And over time, Daniel adapted in the only way he knew how, by retreating into himself, finding comfort in solitude, in routines, in things that didn't require emotional risk, because for him, connection was never something that came naturally. It was something that felt uncertain, unpredictable, and quietly out of reach. And as the years passed, that quiet distance began to shape how he saw the world and his place in it, because some people learn love early, through small gestures, shared laughter, and moments that build confidence over time, but others, like Daniel, learn something else entirely, they learn how to exist without it, how to navigate life without relying on it, how to convince themselves that maybe they don't need it at all, and for a while, that belief felt safe, it gave him control, it allowed him to move through life without facing the discomfort of rejection or the confusion of emotions he didn't fully understand. But what it also did, slowly and almost without him noticing, was create a distance that would become harder to close with each passing year. By the time Daniel reached his teenage years, the world around him had started to change in ways he couldn't ignore, friendships began to shift, conversations took on new meanings, and the people he had grown up with started experiencing things he could only observe from a distance, first relationships, first heartbreaks, first kisses that were often awkward but deeply significant. And while these moments seemed to come naturally to others, Daniel found himself pulling further back, unsure of how to step into something that felt so unfamiliar. And there was one moment, one opportunity that stood out more than the rest, a quiet evening after a school event, when a girl he had known for years walked with him just a little longer than usual, their conversation slowing, their steps almost in sync, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to pause. There was a look, a subtle shift that suggested something more could happen. Something simple, something that would have changed everything. But instead of moving forward, Daniel hesitated, his thoughts racing faster than the moment itself, questioning what to do, how to respond, whether he was even capable of getting it right. And in that hesitation, the moment passed, quietly, without drama, without acknowledgement, just a small shift back to normal, as if it had never existed at all. But for Daniel, it stayed with him, not as a memory he could revisit with fondness, but as a question that lingered: what would have happened if he hadn't stepped back? What might have been different? And as the years moved on, that single moment became something more than just a missed opportunity. It became a pattern, a reflection of every time he chose safety over uncertainty, distance over connection, and in ways he didn't fully understand at the time, that moment would haunt him for years. Adulthood, for Daniel Carter, became a space where he could finally feel in control, where expectations were clearer and outcomes more predictable. He built a career that demanded focus and rewarded consistency, earning respect from colleagues who saw him as dependable and composed, someone who always had things under control, and in many ways, he did. His life was structured, his days were planned, and his environment reflected a sense of order that left little room for unpredictability. But within that structure, there was also a quiet absence, something that didn't stand out at first but became more noticeable over time, because while others began to build lives that included partners, families, and shared experiences, Daniel remained on the outside of that world, not because he openly rejected it, but because he never quite stepped into it. Relationships were something he told himself he would explore eventually, something he would understand when the time felt right, but the time never seemed to arrive, and so instead, he developed routines that filled the space, evenings spent alone, scrolling through glimpses of other people's lives, watching milestones unfold from a distance, telling himself that there was no rush, that he would figure it out later, that there was still time, and for a while, that belief was enough to quiet any lingering doubts. It allowed him to move forward without confronting the reality he had been avoiding. But as the years continued to pass, that quiet reassurance began to feel less certain, because later, the word he had relied on for so long, started to lose its meaning, and without realizing it, Daniel Carter had built a life where everything was in place except the one thing he had never learned how to reach, and by the time he began to question it, he was no longer a young man with time ahead of him. He was a man standing at 40, facing a truth that had been forming quietly for decades. For Daniel Carter, the moment that changed everything didn't arrive with warning or dramatic consequence. It came quietly, disguised as a celebration, a friend's wedding on a warm evening surrounded by familiar faces, laughter, and the kind of joy that feels effortless when shared. And as he stood there watching two people promise a future together, something shifted in him, not suddenly, but with a slow and undeniable clarity that settled in his chest, because for the first time, he wasn't Just observing from a distance, he was comparing, measuring the life in front of him against the one he had been living, and the difference was impossible to ignore. It wasn't about success or stability, it wasn't about the things he had spent years building, it was about something far simpler and far more human, something he had never allowed himself to fully confront. And as the evening went on, as the music faded and conversations softened, a thought surfaced that he could no longer push aside. I've never been loved, not like that. And unlike the quiet reassurances he had relied on for years, this realization didn't fade. It stayed with him long after the night ended, following him back to his apartment, sitting with him in the silence he once found comfort in, but now felt different, heavier, as if the space around him had begun to reflect something he could no longer ignore. And for the first time, Daniel Carter understood that waiting had not brought him closer to anything. It had only kept him still. Taking action, for someone like Daniel, was never going to be simple. It meant stepping into a space he had avoided for most of his life, a space filled with uncertainty, vulnerability, and the very real possibility of rejection. But something had already changed, something that made staying the same feel harder than trying, and so, with hesitation that bordered on doubt, he created a profile, choosing his photos carefully, rewriting descriptions that never seemed quite right, second-guessing every word as if it carried more weight than it actually did. And when he finally pressed submit, there was no sense of accomplishment, only a quiet anticipation mixed with uncertainty, as if he had just entered a world where everyone else already knew the rules. And at first, it felt manageable, conversations that started with polite introductions, brief exchanges that never went too deep. But it didn't take long for the pattern to emerge, messages left unanswered, replies that faded without explanation, moments where he thought he had said the right thing, only to be met with silence. And in that silence, the same doubts he had carried for years began to resurface, questions about whether he was too late, whether he had missed something essential that others had learned long ago. And each interaction, no matter how small, seemed to reinforce the distance he had always felt, until trying began to feel like a reminder of everything he didn't know how to do. And just as he started to consider stepping back, returning to the familiarity of the life he understood, something unexpected happened, something small but significant, because just when he was about to give up, someone replied. Her name was Emily Hayes, and unlike the others, there was something different in the way she communicated, not overly eager, not distant, but steady, present in a way that felt unfamiliar to Daniel. Their conversations didn't rush forward or disappear without warning, they unfolded slowly, naturally, as if there was no pressure to impress or perform. And for the first time, Daniel found himself responding without overthinking every word, sharing pieces of himself in a way he hadn't before. Small details at first, then slightly more personal thoughts, testing the space between honesty and hesitation. And Emily, in her own quiet way, met him there, asking questions, listening, responding with a patience that made the process feel less like a test and more like a conversation. And as the days turned into weeks, a connection began to form, not dramatic or overwhelming, but consistent, something that built gradually with each exchange. And yet, beneath that growing comfort, one question remained, one that Daniel never fully answered. Did she know the truth about him? Did she understand just how new this all was? Or had he managed to present a version of himself that felt more experienced than he actually was? And as their conversations moved closer to something real, something that existed beyond screens and messages, that question became harder to ignore. Their first meeting was set for a quiet evening, a place chosen for its simplicity, somewhere neutral, somewhere that wouldn't demand more than either of them was ready to give. And as Daniel arrived, there was a familiar tension in his movements, the same uncertainty he had felt years ago. But this time, there was no stepping back, no easy exit that wouldn't leave questions behind. And when he saw her, standing there with a calm presence that matched her voice, something shifted again, not entirely comfortable, but not as overwhelming as he had expected. Their conversation started cautiously, small talk that slowly gave way to something more genuine, moments of silence that didn't feel as heavy as he had feared, and as the evening continued, the distance between them began to close, not just physically, but in a way that carried meaning, subtle changes in tone, in body language, in the way they looked at each other, and for Daniel, every second seemed to stretch longer than it should, his awareness heightened, his thoughts moving quickly as he tried to stay present in a moment he had imagined but never experienced, and then, without warning, the space between them shifted in a way that left no room for hesitation, because as their conversation slowed and the night settled around them, Emily leaned slightly closer, her expression calm, her presence steady, and in that moment, everything Daniel had avoided for 40 years came into focus all at once, and that's when she leaned closer. And in that moment, when Emily Hayes closed the distance between them and Daniel Carter felt something he had imagined for most of his life finally begin to happen. Time didn't rush forward the way he expected it to, it slowed, almost to a stop, as if his mind was trying to process something it had never experienced before, the subtle shift of proximity, the warmth of another person choosing to be close, the quiet understanding that there was no script to follow, no memory to rely on, only instinct and presence, and when their lips finally met, it wasn't dramatic or perfect, it was simple, brief, and filled with a kind of hesitation that spoke louder than any confidence could have, and for most people, it would have been just another moment, something that passed without much thought, something that blended into a timeline of similar experiences, but for Daniel, it carried the weight of 40 years. Every missed opportunity, every hesitation, every quiet decision that had led him to this exact point, and for a second, there was nothing else, no past, no future, just the realization that something he once believed might never happen had finally become real, and yet, almost as quickly as that realization arrived, something else followed, something he hadn't prepared for, something that didn't match the expectations he had quietly built over time. Because instead of clarity, instead of the sense of completion he thought would come with finally crossing that line, Daniel felt something far more complicated, a mix of awareness and uncertainty that settled in almost immediately, and as the moment ended and the space between them returned, his mind didn't quiet, it became louder, filled with questions he couldn't answer, emotions he couldn't fully identify, and a lingering sense that what had just happened didn't align with what he had imagined for so many years. And Emily, unaware of the depth of what he was processing, responded with the same calm presence she had shown from the beginning, continuing the conversation as if everything was unfolding naturally, but for Daniel, nothing felt simple, nothing felt resolved, because for the first time, he wasn't wondering what it would be like, he was trying to understand what it actually was. And the difference between those two things was far greater than he expected, and as they parted ways later that night, with a quiet acknowledgement of something shared but not fully understood, Daniel found himself returning to a space that no longer felt the same, not because something was missing, but because something had changed in a way he couldn't yet define. In the hours that followed, the questions came in waves, not loud or overwhelming, but persistent, refusing to fade into the background the way his doubts usually did, because this time, there was no uncertainty about whether the moment had happened, only confusion about what it meant, and as he replayed it in his mind, every detail felt both clear and distant at the same time, the timing, the hesitation, the reality of it all, and yet, the feeling he expected to carry afterward never fully arrived, leaving him with a quiet sense of disconnection that he couldn't ignore, and for the first time, Daniel Carter began to question something deeper than the moment itself, not just why it had taken so long, but whether the time he had spent waiting had changed the way he experienced it altogether, and in that reflection, two questions surfaced that refused to settle: why don't I feel what I thought I would? And did I wait too long? And as those questions lingered, shaping the way he understood what had just happened, Daniel realized that the answer wasn't going to come from the moment itself, it was going to come from something far more personal, something rooted in the years he had spent avoiding exactly this kind of experience, and what he discovered next changed everything. What Daniel Carter began to understand in the days after that night with Emily Hayes was something far more complex than a missed expectation or an awkward first experience. It wasn't about the kiss itself, it wasn't about whether it had been right or wrong, meaningful or ordinary, it was about what surfaced afterward. The quiet realization that the moment he had waited 40 years for did not feel the way he had imagined, not because it lacked importance, but because it revealed something he had never truly confronted, and as he sat with that feeling, replaying not just the event but the years that led up to it, a pattern began to take shape, one that stretched back far beyond adulthood, beyond his career, beyond the routines he had built to keep his life structured and predictable, reaching into a time when connection first became something uncertain, something he didn't quite know how to hold on to. Because this was never just about fear in the present, it was about something that had been forming quietly for decades, something rooted in moments that seemed small at the time but carried weight he didn't fully understand, the early experiences of being overlooked, of standing at the edge of groups that never quite made space for him, of learning that staying quiet felt safer than risking rejection, and over time, those moments didn't just pass, they shaped him. They taught him how to protect himself in ways that didn't feel like protection, but rather like control. And that control became the foundation of his life, not in obvious ways, but in subtle decisions that added up over time, choosing distance over vulnerability, choosing certainty over emotional risk, convincing himself that he simply hadn't found the right moment, the right person, the right circumstances, when in reality, he had been avoiding something far more fundamental, the possibility of being seen fully and not knowing how to respond to it, because vulnerability requires a kind of openness that Daniel had never practiced, not intentionally, but through years of quiet reinforcement, and as he reflected on his past, he began to recognize how deeply that pattern had taken hold, how every missed opportunity wasn't just about timing, but about an internal hesitation that felt automatic, almost instinctive, and for someone who had spent his entire life building stability, the unpredictability of emotional connection felt like something to be managed rather than embraced, and without realizing it, he had created a life where isolation felt familiar, where being alone wasn't a consequence but a choice he had learned to justify, because there was a certain comfort in it, a predictability that didn't demand anything from him beyond what he already knew how to give, and within that comfort, there was a belief that had quietly guided him for years. A belief that made everything else make sense in a way that felt logical, even if it wasn't entirely true. You can't lose what you never had. But that belief, while protective, came with a cost that Daniel could no longer ignore, because the moment he finally allowed himself to step into something real, even briefly, it exposed everything he had been avoiding. It showed him that the absence he had grown used to was not the same as peace, that the control he valued so deeply had also limited his ability to experience something as simple and as meaningful as connection. And for the first time, he saw his life not just as a series of independent choices, but as a pattern shaped by something deeper, something that couldn't be resolved by a single moment or a single experience, and in that realization, the truth became clear in a way that left no room for doubt. The kiss wasn't the problem. It wasn't the missing piece that would suddenly make everything fall into place. It was a reflection, a moment that revealed everything that had come before it. Every wall he had built, every hesitation he had followed, every reason he had given himself to stay where he felt safe, and as that understanding settled in, Daniel Carter faced something far more significant than the experience he had just had. He faced the reality that if anything was going to change, it wouldn't come from waiting for another moment, it would come from confronting everything he had spent years avoiding. In the days that followed, Daniel Carter didn't rush to define what had happened with Emily Hayes. He didn't force meaning onto the moment or try to reshape it into something it wasn't. Instead, for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to sit with uncertainty without retreating from it, and that alone marked a quiet but significant shift, because where he would have once stepped back, closed himself off, and returned to the comfort of distance, he chose something different, something slower, Something that didn't promise immediate clarity but offered something he had avoided for decades, presence, and when Emily reached out again, her message simple and unpressured, he responded, not with the need to impress or perform, but with honesty, a kind of honesty that felt unfamiliar but necessary, and in that exchange, the connection between them didn't disappear, it evolved, becoming something quieter, more intentional, built not on expectation but on understanding, and while there were still moments of hesitation, still questions he couldn't fully answer, Daniel didn't turn away from them, he acknowledged them, allowing the relationship to move forward at a pace that felt real rather than forced, and for the first time, he wasn't trying to catch up to a version of life he thought he should have lived, he was simply experiencing it as it unfolded, one moment at a time. And as weeks turned into something steadier, something that resembled connection rather than uncertainty, Daniel began to notice changes that had nothing to do with grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but everything to do with how he saw himself, the way he spoke, the way he allowed himself to be seen without immediately searching for a way to retreat, and it wasn't perfect, there were still moments where old patterns surfaced, where the instinct to withdraw felt familiar and almost automatic, but now, those moments didn't define him the way they once did, because he had begun to understand them, to recognize where they came from and what they meant, and in that understanding, there was a kind of freedom he had never experienced before, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it, and it was in that space, somewhere between who he had been and who he was becoming, that Daniel Carter found something he hadn't been searching for directly, a sense of possibility that didn't rely on the past or the time he felt he had lost, but on what he was willing to face in the present. And one evening, not long after everything had begun to shift, Daniel found himself standing in front of the same mirror where this story began, the same quiet room, the same reflection looking back at him, but this time, there was no rehearsed expression, no whispered question filled with doubt, only a calm awareness of who he was in that moment, not defined by what he had missed, but by what he had finally allowed himself to experience, and as he stood there, the weight of 40 years no longer felt like something he had to carry alone, it felt like something he had begun to understand, because some people spend their whole lives chasing love, moving from one moment to the next in search of something that always feels just out of reach, while others, like Daniel Carter, spend their whole lives avoiding it, convincing themselves that distance is safer than vulnerability, that waiting is the same as preparing, until one moment forces them to see the truth they can no longer ignore, and as his reflection remained steady, no longer searching for answers it couldn't find, one question remained, quiet but impossible to dismiss: is it ever too late to experience something for the first time, or do we create that limit ourselves? And as Daniel Carter's story settles into something that feels less like an ending and more like a beginning, it leaves behind questions that don't belong to him alone, questions that reach beyond his experience and quietly turn toward you, because while his journey may seem rare, the emotions behind it are something many people recognize in their own lives: the hesitation, the waiting, the way time can quietly shape decisions we never fully confront. So what would you do in his position if you realized that the life you kept postponing had already started to define you? If you found yourself standing at the edge of something you had avoided for years, would you finally step forward or retreat into what feels safe, and be honest with yourself? Could you wait that long? Could you carry that silence for decades and still find the courage to face it when the moment finally arrives? Because stories like Daniel Carter's are not just about what happened, they are about the choices we make, and the ones we avoid. And if this story surprised you or stayed with you longer than you expected, then there's another one you won't believe coming next, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.